So welcome back. Welcome back to our next session that will explore the positive role of religion in preventing violence and in responding to a period of conflict or authoritarian rule. And we'll discuss how religious and faith-based actors play formal or non-formal roles in transitional justice processes. So for this session, I'm very glad to introduce Simon Robbins, who will present the outcomes from the Coalition's Global Initiative for Justice, Truth and Reconciliation project, strengthening religious and faith-based actors' engagement with transitional justice. Simon will introduce a new assessment tool developed by GIJTR team for practitioners to assess under which circumstances and to what extent religious and faith-based actors should engage in transitional justice processes in order to best support truth, justice, and reconciliation goals. Simon is a humanitarian practitioner and researcher with an interest in humanitarian protection, human rights and transitional justice. He combines academic research with a consulting practice, focusing on policy and program support to international agencies, including the UN and NGOs, with an emphasis on states emerging from conflict and violence. He is a senior research fellow at the Center for Applied Human Rights at University of York. His consulting work has sought to provide policy and programmatic support to a range of humanitarian and human rights related programming, including extensive engagement with monitoring and evaluation, and in particular of protection and rule of law interventions. His academic work is driven by a desire to put the needs of victims of conflict at the heart of efforts to address its legacies. And this has led to an engagement with victim-centered and therapeutic approaches to histories of violence, taking a critical approach to transitional justice with a focus on emancipatory approaches driven by victims and participatory approaches that see knowledge production and activism as inseparable. Simon, welcome, and I hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Justine. So, I mean, it's a real pleasure to be a part of this fascinating discussion. And as Justine has said, what I would like to do is introduce the assessment tool on supporting an engagement with religious and faith-based actors in transitional justice that the GIJTR has produced. So I'm going to very quickly try to take you through that today. Next slide, please. So the assessment tool comes out of a project that the GIJTR has run over the last year, which asked how an engagement with faith-based actors can strengthen transitional justice. This was a one-year collaboration between the Coalition, CSVR from South Africa, and PAL-PG. It undertook a set of case studies with religious and faith-based actors, and these comprised Northern Ireland, Sri Lanka, Guatemala, Tibet, South Africa, and Tunisia. And then I was invited to use these case studies as the basis for the development of the assessment tool, which is in an advanced draft now and should be emerging rather soon. So the tool seeks to ask, how can religious and faith-based actors strengthen or even undermine transitional justice processes? It targets civil society actors, many of which you come from, as users, and it will initially be piloted in Zimbabwe with the idea of improving it, making it more practically relevant and contextualizing it in that particular context. Next slide, please. So the toolkit seeks to be a step-by-step guide, a very practical how-to guide to evaluating and working with religious and faith-based actors in transitional justice in any context. So it does that by defining what a faith-based actor is, and spelling out their potential roles in transitional justice. It suggests that an actor has to understand the space for action in their context. Where is the transitional justice process? What is the status of the conflict or the transition? And then use that as a basis for understanding what faith-based actors are present and what any particular faith-based actor can do. And when we talk about playing a role in a transitional justice process, we're talking about both formal processes, truth commissions, trials, and informal processes, processes that are conducted largely independent of the state, perhaps at the community level or by civil society actors. And I'll say a bit more about that. Next slide, please. So, as I said, what I aim to do in about 15 minutes is very quickly walk you through the different elements of the toolkit. This is necessarily going to be very brief. I do urge you, when you have the chance, to look at the toolkit, which is full of many examples of every one of the elements that I'm going to be introducing today. Next slide, please. So the first question to ask when looking at a context and the potential role of faith-based actors is to understand who they are. So we define faith-based actors according to what you see here. So this is obviously churches, religious organizations, members of those organizations, but also political parties, which have a religious characteristic. So that means an organizational structure, which is explicitly religious, a doctrine, which is religious, a religious motivation, an overarching goal, or a discourse, which is predominantly religious. So that obviously includes a whole bunch of different structures. For instance, the Catholic Church in Latin America, in Guatemala, Chile, Brazil, hugely important actors in transitional justice in those contexts. But it also includes Buddhist monks in places like Myanmar and Sri Lanka, which have been mobilized by nationalist politicians to be very negative in terms of actually fostering conflict and challenging efforts at reconciliation. It also includes figures like the Dalai Lama, who's both a religious and a political figure, hugely influential, and even political parties. We have examples in Tunisia, in Northern Ireland, of political parties founded on an explicit religious orientation who are faith-based actors despite being political parties. Next slide, please. The importance of faith-based actors in transitional justice, I think, is clear to most of us. Almost all religions have some ideal of peace or reconciliation or conflict resolution, and thus they're natural mediators. They're perceived as legitimate and credible in a way maybe that political actors are not. And more than that, they have a constituency. They have people who look up to them, who they can bring with them on a journey from conflict to reconciliation, for example. In any context, there will be a range of faith-based actors. There will be different churches. In a Christian context, there might be different confessions. And in an Islamic context, there will be Shia, Sunni, perhaps other sects. And there will be different leaders within those communities who have a different potential for contributing to transitional justice. In many contexts, religious actors will be politically connected. They'll be linked to politicians or will be able to exercise their own political agenda and bring their community with them. That can have a negative side in the sense that they can be linked to states that have committed violations in the past, or they can even play a role in inciting or committing violations themselves. That will have an impact on the role they can play. And there are various different hierarchies and structures. The Catholic Church is a very centralized, fixed structure. Buddhist, Hindu religions will have much more flexible, more decentralized structures. Protestant denominations, somewhere in between, they tend to be smaller, more nimble, less hierarchical. And these have to be considered when looking at the nature of a faith-based actor and what they can bring to transitional justice. Next slide, please. Religion and conflict are often linked. Religion is often seen as a source of conflict, but I think as people have said already today, a few conflicts are really about religion. Most are around identity, of which religion is one part, one contribution. So ethnic conflict, for instance, between different groups defined by an ethnicity will often have a religious element if those two communities have different faiths, and that might be used by one party or the other to foster resentment of the other. But I would argue that religion is typically not a root cause of conflict, but something that is often mobilized to advance it. And then you can think about your context. Is religion a driver of the conflict or a subtext of the conflict? If we look at places like Northern Ireland, the Balkans, Sri Lanka, religion is very visible, but it's not a fundamental driver of those conflicts, which had other roots. Faith-based actors can represent and mobilize communities in conflict to advance conflict or to prevent and overcome conflict. And that's where it's very interesting to see that these figures have an authority to prevent or mitigate conflict, advance transitional justice, conflict resolution, or to worsen it. Next slide, please. So coming to transitional justice, looking at the role of religious and faith-based actors, we see that by and large, these actors are essentially civil society actors, but a particular type of civil society actor that makes them very well placed to lead on transitional justice. Such actors tend to have legitimacy because people trust them. As I said already, it's not like a political leader with a certain agenda. Religious leaders have a different relationship with the communities they seek to represent. And the communities they represent are spiritual communities who are bound to each other and to their leaders around a set of values that are typically quite positive. Again, I will look at the example of the Catholic Church in Latin America, particularly in the 1980s, which had the authority, the legitimacy, and the political space to challenge dictatorships and do independent truth-seeking, to make crimes of those dictatorships visible. Almost no other actor in that context had the capacity to do that safely and legitimately. In many contexts, churches and other religious actors have a history of resistance to violations. We see in South Africa, the church resisting apartheid. Again, in Latin America, the church resisting military dictatorships. That clearly enhances their legitimacy and capacity to engage in transitional justice after a transition. But that also demonstrates that those actors have to be autonomous, independent of the state to a significant extent to fulfill that role after the transition, during a transitional justice process. Next slide, please. And as I've said already, some faith-based actors go beyond civil society. We have political parties in NADA, an Islamic-based political party in Tunisia, in Northern Ireland, where both Protestants and Catholics had political parties that represented them and ultimately represented a particular side in the conflict. The Dalai Lama in Tibet, a spiritual leader until recently, a political leader, and even now a leader with huge political legitimacy. So not only civil society actors. Next slide, please. So this is a table that very briefly tries to summarize some of the added value of religious and faith-based actors in transitional justice. 4 topics here and a summary of what they bring. Ritual and spirituality, in the sense that religions have practices, symbols, language that engage morally with people's attitudes rather than politically, and rituals and approaches that can heal, reconcile, and unite. They tend to have theology and sets of norms that are not political norms. They're related to people, not to the state. They tend to have values around peace and common good. Justice is also often a part of those norms, and a focus on solidarity and collectivity rather than an individualizing approach. They have a mobilization capacity. They can mobilize communities to act, and there's many examples in peace building, struggles for justice, reconciliation. And this can work at the grassroots level in communities right up to the international level, where you have networks of religious actors or international actors like the Catholic Church who can mobilize really at the international level and engage with states. They also have an institutional presence. So they're present often at a national level with the credibility to talk to political leaders and move national agendas, but they're also rooted and present close to ordinary people. And that gives them a role that builds trust with populations. Next slide, please. Saying more about the normative approaches of faith-based actors. Transitional justice is rooted in human rights norms, and different religious actors can have different perspectives on their norms and how they relate to human rights norms. Here I've listed 4 categories. This is not exhaustive, but there are norm makers, people who stress their local context and often emphasize reconciliation and restorative justice rather than the formal accountability of human rights practice that demands criminal prosecution. We see that in northern Uganda, the Acholi Religious Leaders Peace Initiative rejected the International Criminal Court and sought amnesty for people who'd committed quite gross violations in that conflict through traditional tribal processes. And that was something that really reflected what ordinary people in northern Uganda wanted. We have norm adapters who take the international human rights norms and adapt it to fit with local political constraints and culture. And I think South Africa is a very good example of that. You had a political transition where prosecutions were really problematic. So the TRC really adopted a human rights rhetoric, but adopted a model of amnesty using Christian ideas of reconciliation and forgiveness to drive that process. We have norm facilitators, people who basically take the global human rights discourse and use their influence to push it. Again, the church in Guatemala, elsewhere in Latin America did this, used Catholic theology to justify a human rights approach to truth and justice. And then we have norm reflectors who reflect local cultural practices and local norms. And that can include local norms that advance transitional justice, but also those that potentially resist transitional justice and human rights norms. As I've mentioned, nationalist practices in many contexts in Northern Ireland, in Sri Lanka, where religious actors used local nationalist religious norms to prevent reconciliation. Next slide, please. So the toolkit then asks actors to assess the potential for faith-based actors to act on transitional justice in their context. And that demands a couple of steps. What is the status of the transitional justice process? Is there a political space available for faith-based actors to act? Is it safe for them to act? How are community and identity understood in the context, and how do these map onto religion and faith? If the conflict had a religious dimension and an actor represents one side of that conflict, then they have to engage in a particular way, or perhaps together with an actor from the other side, in order to really move things over the division of the conflict itself. And in the toolkit, I present a set of general conditions that need to be met, ideally, for a faith-based actor to act. Having assessed the context, you can then map the faith-based actors that are present in your context. You can ask, where are they present? Are they present nationally? Do they represent everybody? Or are they present just in one area or one community? What relationship does the faith-based actor have to the state? Are they implicated in past violations? That clearly compromises their ability to be perceived as a transitional justice actor. And what's their normative position? Do they take on board human rights norms? Do they push back against them? And then you can ask what contribution to transitional justice any one faith-based actor can make. Next slide, please. The toolkit then goes through the various roles faith-based actors can take in transitional justice. They can act officially, institutionally, as in South Africa, where Desmond Tutu was a very visible, charismatic chair of the Truth Commission. He added huge value, he brought normative values with him, and many South Africans were persuaded by his presence. They can act independently without formal approval, which allows them to take more risks, distance themselves from the institution. This was done in Northern Ireland around weapons decommissioning, where priests from both the Protestant and Catholic churches were involved in guaranteeing that both parties were disposing of their weapons. They can also act in a private capacity in peace negotiations under the radar without being visible. And that's hugely important. And there are rather few examples of those, because many of those are not visible until many years after they've acted. Next slide, please. We can then talk about the role for faith-based actors in formal processes. They can support peace processes. In Sierra Leone, a group of religious leaders from Christian, Muslim, communities played a huge role in engaging with the rebels and the state to advance peace processes. They can advocate for justice. Again, the Catholic Church in Latin America is a great example of this. They can shape the norms of a formal mechanism. Again, going back to the South African TRC, very influenced by Catholic Christian values of forgiveness and reconciliation. They can directly participate in mechanisms. They can engage in consultations, act as a bridge to communities, building trust. Many truth commissions have faith-based actors present as commissioners. In Peru, almost a third of the commission was linked to the Catholic Church, for example. And then they can support formal mechanisms by being a bridge to communities. In South Africa, during the Truth Commission process, church halls were used to host Truth Commission sessions and other logistical support to the process. Next slide, please. There's also roles for faith-based actors in informal non-state processes. They can play a huge role in persuasion, advocacy, and resistance. So lobbying the authorities for or against a process, or resisting a process that's inappropriate or doesn't address human rights norms. They can mobilize communities, build capacity, and educate them, increasing community understandings of transitional justice and the potential process. And they can support victims and communities to represent themselves. They can substitute, they can do their own action of justice. They can support victims materially, offer psychosocial support, create safe spaces and protection, which is a natural part of the pastoral work that many religious actors do. In other places, churches have led processes like exhumation. They can engage in truth seeking and documentation. There's many types of local truth telling, including informal civil society-led truth commissions, as in Brazil or Guatemala, local memorialization activities, site-based action, or community-based truth-telling that brings communities together to seek reconciliation through dialogue. There's education for non-repetition, ensuring history is told, increasing understanding through a perspective on the past. And then there's explicit peace-building activities, conflict resolution with religious actors, bridging the gap between divided communities. So next slide, please. So that was a whirlwind tour through a toolkit that's almost 100 pages long. I hope it gives you a little flavor, and I urge you to please, when it emerges, as it will very soon, please take a look at the toolkit and give us feedback and see its relevance to your own community. We think the toolkit represents a survey of the potential of faith-based actors to play a role in transitional justice, with a guide to practically implementing that role in any particular context. As I've said, we'll be piloting this in Zimbabwe, trying to contextualize and get feedback, but we really welcome any other feedback you can give us. So I'll stop there.